Let me begin by giving credit where credit is due to someone I rarely praise. In fact, I can't remember when I ever have, namely the Jerusalem correspondent of the New York Times, Ethan Brunner. He had a good column this morning. It's worth reading. He's describing the mood in Israel on Independence Day. And he points out that the mood was unusually grim, in fact, maybe uniquely so. He refers to quite an interesting letter that was written by one of the major Israeli correspondents, Ari Shavit, in Haaretz. He's kind of a centrist correspondent, very influential. It's an open letter from Shavit to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he says, we don't really know each other, but I know who you are, you know who I am, and I never write letters to people in the government, but the moment is so significant and dangerous that I just have to write you the letter. And he has a long, open letter. The letter says that you, Mr. Netanyahu, are maybe the most hated person in the world. In Israel, the left hates you, the right hates you, all my friends hate you. I'm the only person who doesn't hate you. And of course, all the Arabs hate you, and everyone in the United States hates you, and the rest of the world, and so on. And he says the reason is because it's not your fault. He says, I really like you. I think you're a nice guy. But Israel's facing maybe the worst crisis in its history. And we have to do something about it. And then he runs through the crises. The worst one is just the general attitude in the world toward Israel. Well, he didn't know it, but the day after his letter appeared, there was a poll, an international poll by the Pew Research Center, which incidentally Ethan Brunner also refers to in his column. And the poll was a global ranking of countries as to what people think about them in many countries. And Israel ranked way down at the bottom, in fact, right next to North Korea, almost at the very bottom in attitudes. So the concern is justified. Of course, it's a lot of paranoia and self-righteousness. The world doesn't understand us. Everyone hates the Jews. We're right about everything, but there's no point. We can't go along just knowing that. We have to somehow do something that'll convince the world. There are some striking analogies which Brunner didn't bring up. One of them is South Africa. Now, there are a lot of analogies drawn between Israel and South Africa, most of them of pretty dubious quality. But one makes a lot of sense. It has to do with the history. If you go back about 50 years, the mood in white nationalist South Africa was very similar to this. They were aware of it. They were aware that they're becoming a pariah society. They reacted very much the way Israel's reacting today. Large-scale international information systems, effort to explain to people, it's not propaganda, it's explanation, just as it's called in Israel, to explain to them that everything we do is right and just and highly moral and you should understand it and so on. And also kind of circling the wagons, a lot of defiance, shifts to the extreme nationalist right, ultra-nationalist movements, and a lot more. It's all very similar. About that time, about 50 years ago, the South African foreign minister, in a conversation with the American ambassador, told him that we know that there are strong resolutions in the United Nations denouncing us, passed by most of the countries in the world, but he said that doesn't really matter. And his words were, what matters more than all other votes put together is the position of the United States in view of its predominant position of leadership in the Western world. So in brief, there's only one vote in the United Nations. That's yours. As long as you vote for us, the rest of them we don't care about. That was an accurate observation then. It's pretty much an accurate observation today, and it became much more so in the case of South Africa as the decolonization proceeded. Remember, this is 1960. Decolonization proceeded, and protests, international protests against apartheid were more intense. Well, actually, the U.S. continued to support, the history is informative. The United States continued to support South Africa, the U.S. government, the apartheid regime, right through the period of mounting protests at home, too. That continued right through the Reagan years, into the late 1980s. Reagan had to, at that time, he already had to evade congressional sanctions against South Africa in order to make sure that U.S. trade increased as it did. And he also had to ignore even business opposition, which is a little unusual. By then, the business world, by the late 70s, early 80s, the American business world was starting to disinvest. They didn't like what was happening. They thought they should get rid of apartheid. But Reagan overruled it, and it was no small matter. In the South African crimes with U.S. support dwarfed the crimes that Reagan was responsible for in Central America and the Middle East, which were pretty awesome. But in South Africa, it was much worse. I mean, just in the surrounding countries, Angola and Mozambique, South African depredations were responsible for killing about 1.5 million people and causing $60 billion of damage. Not a small thing. And the U.S. government, not the population, not even Congress, not even business, but the government continued to support it right through. Now, they had a reason, and the reason is familiar, a justification. The justification was the war on terror. What we're told these days is that George Bush declared the war on terror after 9/11, which is not quite accurate. He redeclared it. Reagan had declared it when he came into office in 1981. So the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy is going to be state-directed international terrorism, the plague of the modern age, return to barbarism in our time, and so on. That's all been wiped out of history for a simple reason. Reagan's war on terror very quickly turned into a massive terrorist war with enormous destruction and atrocities, and that's not a good thing to maintain within history, so it's kind of gone away except for the real world. So when Bush redeclared it, the original had been forgotten. Defense of South Africa was justified by the war on terror. 1988, the Pentagon declared that the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was 1988, after everything that had happened. In fairness, I should say that a year ago, last May, Mandela finally was removed from the U.S. terrorist list, so he can now travel to the United States without special dispensation. But that was 1988. And in fact, the apartheid regime looked unassailable. The foreign minister's analysis in 1950 was pretty accurate. As long as they had that one vote, the world could be disregarded. Right at that time, for reasons which aren't exactly known, U.S. government policy shifted. And within 2 or 3 years, apartheid had collapsed. It was gone. That's a lot to say about what followed, not so beautiful, but it was certainly a major victory for freedom and justice. Well, those are important lessons worth keeping in mind. And it's worth keeping in mind that virtually without exception, Israeli actions and Israeli policies are in fact joint policies. They're U.S.-Israeli policies. Israel can go just as far as the U.S. permits, just as far as it supports it, and no further. When Israel does something the U.S. doesn't like, tells them loud and clear, and they withdraw quietly. Doesn't matter who the president is. Under George W. Bush, there were some extreme examples. In fact, Israel relies much more on the United States for diplomatic, military, and economic support than South Africa did. South Africa was getting support from other terrorist states like Britain and others, Israel in particular. But Israel is really not. It's much more dependent on the United States. And it follows that any meaningful change in the relations between Israel and Palestine is going to have to be based on a change here in the United States. Now, there have been substantial changes in past years. So a meeting like this, say, would have been inconceivable as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. In fact, it wasn't long ago that when I and a couple other people tried to talk about these topics, we literally had to have police protection. And the meetings were broken up. Even my own university, MIT, had to have police protection. Meetings were broken up. Couldn't talk about it. It's all radically changed, particularly since the Gaza attack last year, which made a big shift in attitudes and understanding. And it also means that actions are now feasible that weren't even thinkable up until recently. So, for example, the kind that were taken with regard to South Africa after decades of education and protest. It took a long time. But by 1977, Hampshire College, I think it was the first one, did pass a divestment resolution, and by the early 80s, as I say, it was even congressional resolutions. There's a crucial example, in fact, is just that, a divestment from U.S. corporations that are involved in criminal actions in the occupied territories. That focuses right where it should on our activities, focuses on us. That's what we should do anyway. Your responsibility is yourself, not other people's crimes. And it's also the decisive factor in what's going to happen. That's what we can influence. There is a Brown group, Brown Students for Justice in Palestine, which has called for divestment from U.S. corporations that are involved in criminal actions in the occupied territories. So, in other words, it's asking Brown University to keep to the law, international law, in fact, domestic law. That the actions are criminal is not really in question. The wall, the so-called separation wall, which ought to be called an annexation wall that cuts through the West Bank, as many of you I'm sure know, that was subject to a decision by the World Court, the International Court of Justice, which unanimously, including the U.S. Justice, in a separate declaration, unanimously concluded that the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories. The Geneva Conventions very explicitly bar any transfer of population from the occupying power to the occupied territories. So that means any settlement anywhere in the occupied territories is just illegal. De facto in violation of international criminal law, the U.S. Judge Bergenthal, declared. That includes every part of the fence that goes into West Bank territory, roughly 85% of it, which is there not to defend Israel, but to defend settlers who were there illegally, so the wall's illegal. And the same is true of every other settlement. With regard to Jerusalem, which is the area of extreme contention now, the actions are doubly illegal, and not only in violation of international law, but even in violation of very specific Security Council resolutions, which the U.S. in fact agreed to back in the late 60s and the early 70s, when the United States was still part of the world on this issue, departed in the mid-70s. But those resolutions still stand, so that's double criminality. And it was understood in Israel. So in late 1967, right after the June 67 war, Israel, when question of settlement in the occupied territories was beginning to be brought up, Israel's top legal advisor, Theodore Meron, who's a very distinguished international lawyer, he's on the International commissions, human rights commissions and so on. He informed the government that the Geneva Conventions clearly apply to the occupied territories and that any transfer of Israeli citizens there would be in violation of fundamental international law. The Israeli Attorney General seconded that. And interestingly, the person who was really in charge of the occupied territories, Moshe Dayan, he was defense minister, but he was responsible for what happened there. He agreed publicly. He said, yes, it's in violation of international law, but we're going to do it anyway because countries violate international law all the time, so we will too. And he was basically correct. He probably not consciously, but he was essentially repeating what the South African foreign minister said. As long as the master agrees, it doesn't matter if it's in violation of law. The master happens to be a criminal state anyway, and if it authorizes criminal actions, we're okay. Doesn't matter what the law says. And that goes until today. Very strikingly, in fact, rarely even gets reported. In fact, mostly doesn't. But as I'm sure you all know, the big issue, the big international issue is Iran and its possible pursuit of nuclear weapons capability. And, a lot of hysteria about that. Obama just made a big speech in which presented a new nuclear posture and said the U.S. promises not to attack, not to carry out a first nuclear strike against countries that don't have nuclear weapons, with an exception. He said there are outliers, and the main outlier, as he put it, is Iran. So we can carry out a nuclear attack against them, even though they don't have nuclear weapons. Right through this period, Security Council resolutions and so on, there are other things going on. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is responsible for monitoring the Non-Proliferation Treaty, last September it passed a resolution calling on Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and open its facilities, nuclear facilities, to inspection. Europe and the United States tried to block the resolution, but they failed, and it passed anyway. Well, it didn't really matter. It wasn't reported in the United States or in England, and one or two notices here and there. Also unreported, except for the Mooney newspaper in Washington, the Washington Times, was that Obama immediately informed Israel that it doesn't apply to them, so they can forget about it. At the same time, the Security Council passed a resolution which got plenty of publicity. It was described as aimed at Iran, so it was good. It called on all states to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to settle their disagreements within the framework of the UN Charter and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, meaning by peaceful means. Well, those provisions were directed against the United States. There's only 2 countries in the world that are threatening the use of force, which is also criminal. Take a look at the UN Charter, which bars the threat or use of force in international affairs. But across the spectrum in the United States, the threat of force is considered legitimate, and often the use of force. So yes, it's a criminal state across the spectrum. And so the U.S. and Israel are the only countries that are threatening the use of force, and in fact preparing for it. So whether they'll do it, who knows? But without report here, the United States has recently sent to the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, has sent submarine tenders to care for nuclear submarines. The nuclear submarines are undetectable and they can carry nuclear weapons. And it has also sent to Diego Garcia the biggest bombs in the U.S. arsenal, short of nuclear weapons, what are called massive ordnance penetrators, bunker busters they're called. They're aimed specifically at Iran, nobody else. There's a huge 13-ton bombs, which are supposed to be able to penetrate deep into the earth through, thousands of tons of reinforced concrete. It doesn't get reported here, but of course it's known to Iranian intelligence, and it's supposed to be. It's a threat of force. Actually, the Diego Garcia Diego Garcia is an island which isn't talked about much, but it's crucial to U.S. International aggression. It's the major base for the bombing of the Middle East and Central Asia and so on. It's actually was a British island. The British expelled the population on orders of the master. They appealed to be returned and won in British courts, but as Diane said, law doesn't matter if the master says no, so they can't return. Diego Garcia is part of Africa. The African Union, just a couple of months ago, established a nuclear weapons-free zone. If anybody were really interested in stopping nuclear and limiting nuclear proliferation, what they'd be doing is supporting nuclear weapons-free zones around the world. Well, Africa finally had one, but they can't implement it because of Diego Garcia. The United States and Britain, loyally trailing behind, refused to allow the nuclear-free treaty to apply to Diego Garcia because they intend to use it. They do use it for storing nuclear weapons and might use it for attacking the outliers. That's incidentally not the only case. There's also a South Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone, which also isn't implemented because the U.S. insists on excluding the Pacific Islands, which are used for bases where the U.S. stores nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines, and so on. So that's not implemented. Come back to another important nuclear weapons-free zone in a moment. Anyway, the outlier is Iran. Now, actually, there are 3 countries that have not ever signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, nuclear states: Israel, India, and Pakistan. All developed nuclear weapons with U.S. support and are still doing so. Pakistan, it's one of Ronald Reagan's gifts to the world. India, it's accelerated in the last couple of years. Under Bush, there was a U.S.-Indian treaty signed, which is in direct violation of all the international conventions on non-proliferation. It permits India to develop nuclear weapons in secret, and it permits the U.S. to help them by providing them with nuclear technology. Now, the story is it's for civilian use, but everybody knows that the boundary between civilian use and military application is quite small. And furthermore, even providing it for civilian use permits India to divert its technology and research to nuclear weapons, as in fact it's doing quite openly. So immediately after the Security Council resolution I mentioned, India announced, though it wasn't reported here, that it can produce nuclear weapons with the same yield as the superpowers, the US and Russia. Obama quietly informed India that the Security Council resolution doesn't apply to them. Pakistan responds to India, so they're openly, in fact, developing new nuclear weapons facilities, uranium enrichment, and so on. Those are the real threats of nuclear weapons in the region. The 3 countries that refuse to sign the treaty and that are backed by the U.S. When they openly defy the Security Council, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and so on. Not the outlier may be a problem, but that's a U.S. issue. And so the U.S. is not supported by the world on this, contrary to what you read. So the call for sanctions, what you read is Iran is defying the international community. International community is a term that has a rather technical meaning. It refers to Washington and whoever happens to agree with it at the moment. So the international community excludes the majority of states in the world, the former non-aligned movement, which vigorously support Iran's right to develop nuclear power, as permitted under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Everyone agrees. It excludes China and Russia. It excludes India, which is opposed to sanctions. Excludes Brazil, which is pointedly opposed to sanctions. Turkey, the one major Middle East power, doesn't want sanctions. In fact, even the Arab League, which the U.S. is supposedly catering to, they just had a meeting and declared their opposition to sanctions, call for diplomacy. But nevertheless, the international community steadfastly insists on higher sanctions. Incidentally, the American people aren't part of the international community. I haven't seen a recent poll. Opinion may have changed after all the propaganda the last couple of years. But in 2007, a considerable majority of Americans agreed with the world outside the international community. That is, agreed that Iran has a right, the same right as everyone else, to develop nuclear energy. Well, they're the outliers. There was a meeting in Tehran of 60 states a couple of days ago. It's very hard to find out who was there because nothing's covered. But there was a meeting, and they came out with a declaration calling for an end to any nuclear weapons, and they called for establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Now, that's an interesting proposal. In this case, the U.S. population is overwhelmingly in support of it, and so is just everyone in the world who's polled, at least. Very strong support for a nuclear weapons-free zone that would mitigate and maybe terminate whatever the alleged threats are of Iran developing a nuclear weapons capability. They just called for it in the Tehran meeting. I don't think it was reported here. There are two countries that have a particularly deep commitment to this, namely the United States and Britain. The reason is because when the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq, they tried to provide a kind of a thin legal cover for it, and the way they did it was by appealing to a Security Council resolution, Resolution 687 in 1991, which called on Iraq to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction. And the U.S. and Britain claimed they hadn't done it. We know that was false, but that was the claim. And that justified their invasion of Iraq. Well, if you bother reading that resolution, you'll see that it commits the signers to establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. So the U.S. and Britain, over and above all others, have a commitment to this. And if there was a real interest in non-proliferation instead of just rhetorical, that's what would be pursued. Well, going back to Israel, which is not the only beneficiary of U.S. criminality, India and Pakistan are too. But in the case of Israel, they're immune from the International Atomic Energy Agency, Security Council, and in fact, a long record of U.S. vetoes of Security Council resolutions that charge Israel with one or another crime. Actually, the U.S. vetoes resolution charging itself with crimes too. If we had a free education system in the United States, everyone would know that the United States is the only country that has rejected a World Court decision. In the past, it was one of three. Libya and Albania also hadn't accepted them, but they've since accepted them. So the U.S. is in splendid isolation. That was a World Court decision calling on the United States to terminate its terrorist war against Nicaragua. Of course, totally rejected. That went to the Security Council. There were two resolutions calling on all states, didn't mention the U.S., calling on all states to observe international law. The U.S. vetoed both of them. France and Britain politely abstained. So there are outliers in the world, but Iran's got an awful government, nobody doubts that. But there are other outliers, maybe more significant ones, certainly more significant for us. Well, it's going back to Israel-Palestine, it's kind of strange on the surface that the conflict persists. Why is it called unresolvable? Toughest problem in the world. I mean, there are plenty of problems in the world where it's hard even to conjure up a solution, to imagine one. In this case, you can not only conjure it up, but everyone knows what it is. And furthermore, the whole world agrees to it outside of the United States and Israel. And in fact, it's even got international law on its side. It's supported by the Arab League. It's supported by the Organization of Islamic States, including Iran. It's supported by the relevant non-state actors like Hamas. The resolution, the basic contours are very well known. Two-state settlement on the international border, pre-June 67 border, perhaps with minor and mutual modifications. That was the official U.S. term back in the late 60s and early 70s before the U.S. departed from the world on this issue. So settlement on the international border is a ceasefire line, so kind of messy, with minor and mutual modifications and various conditions about Jerusalem, refugees, and so on. Well, that's a solution. But much like the nuclear-free, weapons-free zone, there's a barrier, and it's right here. The U.S. won't accept it. And as long as the U.S. doesn't accept it, Israel feels entirely free to continue to violate it. Now, that's been going on since the mid-70s. In 1976, January 76, the major Arab states brought a resolution to the Security Council calling for a settlement roughly in these terms, recognizing the rights of every state in the region, including Israel, to live in peace and security within recognized boundaries and all the standard diplomatic terminology. It was vetoed by the United States. Again, in 1980, record in General Assembly is similar. A veto by the United States is in fact a double veto, or maybe a triple veto. First of all, it doesn't happen, and secondly, it's vetoed from reporting, and third, it's vetoed from history. So you have to look pretty hard to find out much about this. That's what it means to have overwhelming power. Those are some of the prerogatives. Overwhelming power and a very obedient intellectual class, which keeps things quiet, doesn't make sure that young minds aren't distorted by knowing too much about the world. But in fact, in this entire record of 35 years of U.S. rejectionism, there's one exception, and a very illuminating one. It's in 2000, the year 2000. It's not the one people talk about. Everyone talks about the Camp David negotiations, which failed, but that wasn't the end of it. After the collapse of the Camp David negotiations, President Clinton recognized that the U.S.-Israeli position at the negotiations could not be accepted by any Palestinians, even the most, what are called moderate ones, pro-U.S. ones. So Clinton, in December of 2000, issued what he called his parameters. They were kind of vague, but somewhat more forthcoming. He then said that both sides, Israel and the Palestinians, had accepted his parameters. Both sides had made reservations to them. Well, they met in Taba, Egypt in January 2001 to try to iron out the differences, the reservations. And they made quite a bit of success. In their last press conference, we know a lot about this. It was internationally monitored. There's extensive reports from Israel, most of it in Hebrew, but some in English. So we know quite a lot about it. They practically reached agreement. In their last press conference, they said if they had a few more days, they could have reached agreement on every issue, pretty much in line with the international consensus, tweaking it here and there. There were a few issues still. Israel called off the negotiations prematurely, and that was the end of formal negotiations. Informal, pretty high-level negotiations continued, leading to some agreements, the main ones called the Geneva Accord. It was rejected by Israel, ignored by the United States, so that's down the tube. All of this is quite significant. It means that a resolution in terms of the international consensus is feasible if the United States will permit it. Unfortunately, there's very little sign of that. Well, meanwhile, the U.S. and Israel are just extending and deepening the illegal occupation. In 2005, September 2005, Israel made a sensible tactical decision. The right-wing government, Ariel Sharon's decision, government decided that it doesn't make any sense to keep 7,000 or 8,000 Israeli settlers in the Gaza Strip, which by then had been half destroyed. taking maybe a third or more of the resources and land, and protected by half the Israeli army. So he made the decision to transfer the settlers illegally settling in the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, which is much more important. Now, it could have been done just like that, just a flick of a wrist, But they decided to stage what was called a national trauma. So there was a huge trauma, completely farcical. If they'd want to do it quietly, all they had to do was announce that on August 1st, the IDF, the Israeli army, is going to leave the Gaza Strip. At that point, the 8,000 settlers would have climbed into the trucks provided to them, and they would leave their subsidized homes in the Gaza Strip to subsidized homes in the West Bank. But you don't get any propaganda out of that. What they wanted was a trauma. So it was staged, big front pictures on the front pages of, a little boy pleading with the soldiers not to destroy his home, Boston Globe and so on, and shouts of never again and so on, no more Holocausts. And it was pretty effective. Actually, it was a farcical repeat of a similar staged trauma in 1982 when they had to take settlers out of Egypt, out of the northeastern Sinai. There were commentators in Israel who just ridiculed it correctly, like one of Israel's leading sociologists, Baruch Kimmerling, died recently, just ridiculed the farce as it should have been done. But it played where it mattered, here. So never again. We've got to hold on to the West Bank. Well, after the technical withdrawal from Gaza, Israel maintained its total control, and it was pretty vicious. It picked up in intensity a couple of months later when the Palestinians committed a serious crime. There was a free election in Palestine in January 2006, and they voted the wrong way. Now, that's not acceptable. You can do all kind of things, but not that. You don't vote the wrong way in a free election. So the U.S. quite openly, Israel too, of course, turned to punishing the Palestinians for this crime. And it wasn't secret. Like, you can read it in a column on the front page of the New York Times, right alongside another column which is lauding our magnificent messianic pursuit of Wilsonian ideals and supporting democracy and so on. There's no contradiction. So, Orwell, you may recall, had a concept which he called doublethink. Doublethink is the capacity to have two contradictory ideas in mind at the same time and believe both of them. That's almost a definition of the intellectual culture. But this was a dramatic case. And immediately after that crime, the punishment of the Gaza Strip sharply increased. Got worse later. I won't go through the details, but it's pretty awful. Very savage siege, brutality, and so on. It peaked December 2008 with the latest U.S.-Israeli invasion, which was murderous and destructive. The invasion, it's called an Israeli invasion. It's a U.S.-Israeli invasion. U.S. arms, U.S. diplomatic support, and so on. It was given a pretext, but every act of aggression has a pretext, so you have to ask, does it mean anything? Actually, the pretext was that Israel was defending itself against rockets from Gaza. That pretext is accepted by the human rights groups, by the Goldstone Commission, by about 100% of commentary. It doesn't have a particle of credibility. Israel and the U.S. knew exactly how to stop the rockets. There had been a ceasefire, and during the ceasefire, Israel admits there was not a single Hamas rocket. Israel violated the ceasefire a couple of months earlier, and the rocket started. Hamas called for renewing the ceasefire. Israel considered it and refused. Well, the use of force when you haven't exhausted, even tried peaceful means is just it's just major war crimes. I mean, the discussion about the war crimes in Gaza is trivial in comparison. So Israel, in fact, got a free pass from the Goldstone report and others. Well, since then, the savagery continues. I won't go on the details. I'm talking too long. It's pretty similar in the West Bank. The restrictions are not as severe in the West Bank as they are in Gaza, which has become basically unlivable. That's the point. But they're bad. But Israel has finally understood in the West Bank that it should do what every colonial power has done. They don't punish the entire population. Ensure that the elites are making out fine. You go to any third world country, under colonial rule or neo-colonial rule, and there's a sector of wealth and privilege which is, beyond anything that we dream of. And Israel's finally understood that that's what you do. So if you go to Ramallah, you can go to elegant restaurants and go to the theater. It's just like being in Paris and London. You go a couple of miles away, and it's horrible. But that allows the journalists and others to talk about the wonderful achievements in the West Bank. Well, when you run in fact, Israel is following, finally, the explicit recommendation of Israeli industrialists about 10 years ago, who urged that Israel should move from, what their words, from colonialism to neo-colonialism. It should establish the standard neo-colonial structures like this. Took a long time to realize it, but they're doing it. In fact, that becomes even more like South Africa. South Africa relied on the Bantustans, and it tried to keep them, they're pretty awful, but it tried to keep them viable. It needed them. That was their labor force. So they kept them going. They tried to get international recognition for them, but outside Israel, no country recognized them. Israel's not doing it for all the West Bank. It's just doing it for the elite sector in Ramallah, where the Palestinian Authority is. Well, if you want to maintain a neo-colonial system, you have to have an iron fist, so you need military force. And there is one. It's the army run by General Keith Dayton. Actually, that's the more mild of the military forces, but the better known one. U.S. general runs an army, trained in Jordan with Israeli participation and support, and it keeps a grip over the population. In fact, the Obama administration was particularly impressed by how well the army worked during the attack on Gaza. During the attack on Gaza, there were no protests in the West Bank, which kind of surprised everyone. And that's attributed to the power of the Dayton army, which prevented any protests. So Palestinians, of course, they can't demonstrate or anything, but they were not even allowed to protest the destruction of the other half of Palestine, what's going on in Gaza. John Kerry, in particular, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was particularly impressed with this. And he said, finally, Israel may have a legitimate partner for peace, thanks to the success of the General Dayton Army in suppressing the population sufficiently so they can't even protest against massive atrocities. Well, let's turn finally to the options for Palestinians. What are they? Here the discussion, I think, is pretty misleading, and you should think it through. One option, of course, is the international consensus. And there's a barrier. The U.S. won't accept it, but that's our problem. Now, a very common view, you hear it all over the place now, from Palestinians, from Israeli doves, from the supporters of Palestinians here, that the alternative to that is that Israel takes over the territories, it becomes a single state, and you can have a civil rights struggle, an anti-apartheid struggle within this single state, in which Palestinians will be roughly half the population. And that's many of the doves, including Palestinian leaders, think, okay, that's better than the vanishing two-state settlement. There's only one problem with that logic. Those are not the two alternatives. There's a third alternative, which isn't discussed. The third alternative is that the U.S. and Israel continue doing exactly what they're doing. And what they're doing is very clear. It has a name. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert called it convergence. What Israel with U.S. backing is doing is taking over everything, annexing everything behind the separation wall, some of the most valuable land, all the water resources, that's quite crucial in this arid region. It takes over the Jordan Valley, more fertile territory, kicks out the Palestinians, and runs some salients, settlement salients right through the territories. Actually, there are three of them. Big one east of Greater Jerusalem. Jerusalem's been sharply expanded. There's one that goes almost to Jericho, and two others to the north, one taking in the town of Ariel, the other town of Kadumim. You take a look at a map. If you look at a map, it looks as if it doesn't penetrate too deeply into the West Bank, but that's misleading because the area where it doesn't penetrate is mostly rocky desert where you can't settle. The livable part of the West Bank is broken up into four major cantons, what Ariel Sharon, in fact, the architect of this, called Bantustans. He was honest, except that they're not cared for as well as the Bantustans. So Israel will take those, no demographic problem, very few Palestinians. If there are a few, you kick them out. No problem of too many non-Jews in a Jewish state. No civil rights struggle, no apartheid struggle. As for the Palestinians, they can rot up in the hills. Israel takes no responsibility for them. They can follow a proposal of Moshe Dayan back in '67. The defense minister was in charge. He said we should tell the Palestinians that we have no solution for you. You're going to live like dogs, and whoever wants to leave can leave, and we'll see where that goes. Well, yeah, that's the policy. And that's the real alternative to a two-state settlement. There is no alternative of the kind that's being discussed, because neither Israel nor the United States, nor in fact anyone in the world, is going to accept that. Rather, they'll continue doing exactly what they're doing. Now, that's not going to change unless there are changes inside the United States. As in the current world scene, it's hard to see where else changes could come from. And that's kind of an optimistic conclusion for us, for people who oppose current U.S.-Israeli policies, because here is the one place where we can influence what happens. And here is the one place that matters. That's where there's going to make a decisive difference. Now, there are implications for tactical choices. I think they should be pretty obvious, but I'll stop there. Sorry to have gone on too long. Take a look at the history of apartheid. It's suggestive. Not exact, but suggestive. Took decades of education and organizing, things like this, before the situation in the United States reached the point where Congress, the business world, general population, was so opposed to apartheid that the Reagan administration had to lie its way around it to try to maintain the support. Well, okay, that's one thing that could be done. Another thing that could be done is what began in the case of South Africa in the late 70s, namely divestment. By then it already had the support of a large part of the population, including even businesses and pretty soon Congress, but the requirement that U.S. corporations divest from white nationalist firms in South Africa, which they themselves are already beginning to do under pressure here. Okay, that can be done. Now that's, and you can go beyond. There were a number of international reports about the Gaza attack. One of the most important was from Amnesty International, not exactly an extremist organization. They called on the United States to withhold all arms shipments from Israel, saying that the arms shipments violate international law, which they do, and they even violate U.S. domestic law. Arms shipments are supposed to be subject to the condition that they are used only for defensive purposes or for, internal security. And the Gaza attack had no defensive purpose, as I mentioned, and certainly wasn't for internal security. And they were used in commission of major crimes, crime of aggression, lots of other war crimes. So there could be a popular movement here to call on the U.S. government to live up to its own laws and to terminate arms shipments. And there's a lot of other things, you know. So there's no shortage of things that we can do. Well, you know, it's no deep secret. I mean, like we're doing right now. How did people, just take a look at the change, just take the recent years in the United States. You can go all the way back in history. But or you go back further, how was slavery overcome? How did women get the right to vote? You know, how since the 1960s were women's rights, you know, pretty substantially established, not perfect, but totally different from anything before. How were civil rights achieved? How did environmental concerns begin to be addressed? Not well enough, but at least somewhat. And every step forward in history comes the same way. And people like you do something about it. And it's a very free country. You can do all sorts of things. People in universities are extremely privileged. Students, for example, are in the moment of their lives when they are most free. They're sort of out of parental control. They don't yet have the burdens imposed on them to try to survive in a society where incomes for the majority have stagnated for 30 years because of government corporate policies. So they're kind of free. They can do lots of things that others don't have a choice about. Okay, do them. Yeah, that's fine. I think that's one of the things you can do, but there's plenty more. I mean, we all know that a vote doesn't mean much.
Thank you. It doesn't.
A vote, yeah. I mean, in more democratic countries than ours, that's understood. Like, take, say, the poorest country in South America, Bolivia. I mean, they had a pretty remarkable election in 2005, another one just last year, in which the majority of the population, indigenous people, the most repressed people in the continent, had by then organized enough to enter the political arena and vote somebody from their own ranks. You know, not some rich guy from, who went to Skull and Bones at Yale. But they've elected someone from their own ranks. They formulated the programs, which the president is following, serious programs. And the voting was just one moment in an ongoing struggle. You know, it wasn't, I go to the polls, I push a button, and I forget about it for the next 4 years. It was, there's just an ongoing popular struggle about all kind of serious issues, access to water, control of resources, complex questions of ethnic and civil rights in a complex society. And they're at it all day, all the time. Okay, that's functioning democracy. We've got a long way to go. But we've had it in the past, but it's kind of been suppressed. And it can be recovered. And that's what elections ought to be, just a moment in a process which goes on from there.
Hi. First, thank you so much for coming. I've learned a lot listening to what you shared with us. My question is specifically about Iran and the nuclear weapons and the discussion that you were having with regard to Iran and the international community. I definitely understand the idea of a country obtaining a nuclear weapon or developing one themselves out of a form of protection or to be on the same, I guess, international status as other countries who are considered superpowers or on the same level as a superpower because they themselves have nuclear weapons. But what do you do when a country is openly trying to develop one or obtain one and also openly threatening to wipe out a country and claiming that a country shouldn't exist? I mean, those are two really big issues that we're dealing with, and I didn't really think you addressed that, and I was curious what you had to say.
Well, what do you do about countries that already developed nuclear weapons outside the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and are daily violating resolutions of the Security Council and the International Atomic Energy Agency? I mean, that's the much more serious problem.
But that's a different situation because those countries aren't openly threatening to wipe out another country.
Nor is Iran. Just take a look at the statements. The statements are that they don't think, they said actually it goes back to Khomeini at the time of the U.S.-Iranian alliance, the Israeli-Iranian alliance, and Israel didn't care about it then. And it keeps being repeated. The statement is that, in the course of time, Israel should no longer exist. Well, actually, I happen to agree with that too. In fact, so do a lot of people in Israel, the ones who think there should be a single democratic state. That's not calling for wiping anyone out. In fact, Iran has supported the international consensus on the two-state settlement. Actually, there are two countries that are not only calling for some nation not to exist, but are destroying it, namely the U.S. and Israel. That's their position with regard to the Palestinians. And they're not just saying it. I stress, they're not just saying it, they're doing it day by day. That's the meaning of the policies that are going on right before our eyes in Gaza and the West Bank, which we are supporting and paying for. So sure, you shouldn't call for the destruction of another nation, and you shouldn't implement that. Actually, the official position of Israel, backed by the United States, they've slightly modified it, but back about 20 years ago, their official position, the coalition government, Labor, Likud, was that there cannot be, I'm quoting it, an additional Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel. In other words, they declared, and the U.S. supported that there already is a Palestinian state, namely Jordan. I mean, the Palestinians object. They say, no, wait a minute, that's not our state. But who cares about them? We say that's your state, and there can't be an additional one. Well, that goes well beyond calling for the destruction of another country. I mean, it's analogous to saying that if somebody came along, suppose Ahmadinejad said, Jews don't need Israel because they already have New York. Okay? I mean, we'd call that a revival of Nazism. But that's the official, has been the official U.S.-Israeli position. So there's a lot to be, incidentally, about Iran. Nobody in their right mind wants Iran to have nuclear weapons, or anyone else. But it is and it's a horrible regime, undoubtedly, though there are worse ones in the region, which are our allies. Everyone, and I'm not referring to Israel, I'm referring to the other Arab states. I mean, in comparison with Saudi Arabia, Iran looks like a civil rights paradise. But but it's awful, no doubt. And there's a way to deal with it, like, for example, moving towards a nuclear weapons-free zone. But among strategic analysts, including Israeli ones, there's no real question about why Iran is moving to nuclear weapons capability, which is not the same as having nuclear weapons. It's just being at a point where you could have them, like most of the advanced industrial world is in that position. Japan, Italy, all sorts of countries. The reason is very simple. Actually, it was described by one of Israel's leading military analysts, very hawkish, Martin von Crefeld, a couple of years ago. After the invasion of Iraq, he wrote an article in which he said he doesn't know if Iran is developing nuclear weapons, and he hopes not, but he says if they're not developing nuclear weapons, they are crazy. That was his word. They're not developing them, they're crazy. The United States has just announced we're going to attack anybody we feel like and invade you if we can do it with impunity. So you better have a deterrent. Well, maybe they're developing a deterrent. No serious analyst thinks that they could use nuclear weapons. I mean, if Iran had nuclear weapons and missiles, which nobody sane wants them to have, I mean, if they went as far as even loading a missile, the country would be vaporized, instantly, even if there was any suspicion of it. Well, the clerics may be hideous people, but they've shown no particular inclination for suicide and destruction of everything that they own and everything they value. Same is true about leaking nuclear weapons to others. If there was any suspicion that they were doing that, you can say goodbye to Iran. So the chances they're using it are, probably at the level of an asteroid hitting the Earth or something like that. But it's a serious problem. In fact, if you look at the Israeli literature, they're pretty straight about it. They say that the real threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon is not against Israel, but it's against Zionism. That is, what they're afraid of is that if the region becomes too dangerous, people in Israel are just going to leave. You know, people who have the capacity to, more educated, wealthier, and so on, because they won't want to live in a region with that threat. And in fact, emigration is a pretty serious problem. Emigration of the educated and the trained, educated sectors. So they don't want to face that threat. But I don't think any serious strategic analyst, at least I've never seen one, who thinks that there's the threat that Iran might use a nuclear weapon. I mean, it would total suicide. You know?
Thank you.
First, thank you, and good evening, Dr. Chomsky. My question is concerning the just getting information. How do we inform the intellectual classes? Where do you find your information, and how do you access truth in a media that's so corrupt and overtaken by corporate interests?
Just how do you become a good biologist? You work, you know. I mean, you know, the important results aren't like written in boldface. I mean, you know, the best biologist is not somebody who read all the technical papers there are. I mean, you can't do that. You have to know what to look for. And you have to, like, take, say, some of the things I mentioned, like the International Atomic Energy Agency resolution on Israel that I mentioned. Well, I was lucky. I happened to be in Mexico last September, and they happen to have an independent newspaper in Mexico. It's the only one in the Western Hemisphere that I know of. Very good newspaper, you know, big newspaper, second largest in Mexico, gets no commercial advertising because business won't advertise there. But they do very well just on reader support. And they happened, while I was there, they happened to run an Associated Press piece on this. Well, you know, I didn't know whether to believe it or not, so when I came home, I checked up Associated Press, which is on the internet, and yeah, it's true. Then, you know, I did a media search, and I found out that there was one mention of it in the United States in the Mooney paper in Washington, the Washington Times. There was also one in the United Kingdom in the Irish Times. Okay, that's the kind of thing you got to do on all sorts of issues. I mean, if you know what you're looking for and you're willing to put the effort into it, you can find out a lot of things. Now, for an individual, it's extremely hard. You have to be kind of a fanatic. But if you're in a group, you know, if you're part of an organization, it gets a lot easier. I mean, that's one of the advantages of joining with other people. You can do a lot of things you can't do by yourself. So if somebody finds something, you disseminate it, you know, others help out, and pretty soon you get things done.
And one more thing, if you could just quickly repeat the column you mentioned in the beginning of your talk.
Oh, this morning's New York Times. Ethan Brunner.
All right, thanks.
Who I think is a terrible correspondent, but he happened to have a good column this morning, good, honest column. Now, he also did his homework. He dug up the Shavit article, which I didn't expect. I don't think it's in English, so it's in Hebrew, I believe. And he also dug up that international poll, which I haven't seen reported anywhere.
So thanks for coming again. I recently watched the classic video of you with William F. Buckley debating the Vietnam War back in the 60s. And so I feel like you've been asked probably every question underneath the sun. So I guess my question would be, what does Noam Chomsky now wish that Noam Chomsky back when he was debating Buckley in the 60s, what did he wish he knew? And if you could also indulge us, what is your happiest moment in life?
I don't answer personal questions. There are some. Well, I don't actually remember. I think that debate was in '69, so I can't remember it in any detail. But looking back at the period in general, my main regret is I was much too mild. I mean, I should have been taking a much stronger position.
I mean, Buckley would disagree with that.
He would disagree, yeah. But if I was having a debate with some Soviet commissar and I criticized what Russia was doing, he'd say it's too harsh. You know. But maybe you have to remember that it was not easy then. In retrospect, the sort of fairy tale is that everyone was opposed to the war. That's absolutely untrue. I mean, in the early stages of the war in Vietnam, it was much harder to talk about than it is to talk about Israel-Palestine today. I mean, as late as October 1965, that's 3 years after Kennedy had launched a major war against the South. In fact, the South was practically destroyed. We tried to have our first public meeting in Boston. Boston's a pretty liberal city. And there's a place in downtown Boston, the Boston Common, which is dedicated to open meetings. So we figured, okay, we'll take a chance and have a public meeting on the Boston Common criticizing the war, very mild criticisms. I mean, it was broken up by students. If it wasn't that there were a couple hundred state police there, we probably all would have been killed. The Boston Globe, the liberal newspaper, huge denunciation. How dare you stand up and criticize our magnificent government and so on. It took a long time before any kind of a peace movement developed. And then if you look at how it developed, in fact, you can read this today in your history books and in the press and so on, what developed was quite different in the elite culture and in the popular culture. If you look at the elite culture, which you're going to read in a history book or in the newspapers and so on, was that there was a debate over whether the war was winnable or not. Okay. In fact, when people make analogies to Afghanistan, or Iraq, they say, well, is it winnable? I mean, that's like a debate in the Nazi general staff after Stalingrad. Did Hitler make a mistake in opening a two-front war? Should we have knocked out England first? I mean, that's the kind of debate that takes place here now, decades after the Vietnam War. Try to check and see, history book, press, journals, a debate over whether it was simply a monstrous crime, the kind of crime for which Nazis were hanged at Nuremberg. Go on. I mean, and same today. I mean, take, say, Obama. He's considered a principled opponent of the Iraq War. A lot of praise. What was his criticism? His criticism was that it was a strategic blunder, like Nazi generals after Stalingrad, or what you could read in Pravda in 1985, when a lot of people were saying openly it was a strategic blunder to invade Afghanistan. We don't call that principled critique when others do it. I mean, we call it criminal. But to try to look at ourselves is extremely hard. I mean, not just in the United States, almost anywhere. Your own history is whitewashed consistently. I mean, we even do it in personal life, if we're honest. It's pretty hard to look in the mirror, but it's crucial if you want to understand the world. And it's crucial for the entire world in our case, because the U.S. is so powerful.
You don't want to answer my second question?
Pardon?
You don't want to answer my second question?
Sure.
What's your happiest moment in life?
Happy? No, that one, as I said, I'm not going to answer.
You can say like clam chowder or something. That's fine.
Pardon?
You just can say clam chowder.
No, a lot happier than that.
Hello. Thank you again for coming to speak to us today. It was very informative. In your talk, you discussed the importance of the Geneva Conventions today in setting an appropriate standard and code of conduct and behavior in international affairs, and especially in times of conflict. You used the Geneva Conventions and then you applied it to Israel, especially in their last Gaza war and some of the actions that Israel's done in the past. I wanted to ask your opinion. Do you think that these same conventions and standards should be applied to Hamas, even though they are a non-state actor and don't have conventional military forces? And also, do you think the Geneva Conventions need to be adapted today for the question of asymmetric warfare?
Well, on the second, I don't see any reason whatsoever why the Geneva Conventions should be modified for what we call asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare refers to our invasions of other countries and resistance to the invasions by people who are weaker. We didn't call it asymmetric warfare when we were supporting radical Islamists to try to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan. Okay? We didn't call the partisans in Europe asymmetric warfare when they were fighting the Nazis. Asymmetric warfare means when somebody tries to defend themselves against us or our clients. And there's no reason now why the Geneva Conventions have to be changed for that any more than there were when the Nazis killed the partisans, you know. So the second question, no. As far as Hamas is concerned, Hamas is a political party, okay? And you can't really apply international law to a political party. You can say that actions of a political party are criminal, right? And some of Hamas's actions are criminal. So sure, if for example, take, say, the Amnesty International report I mentioned. It didn't just say we should stop supplying arms to Israel. It said we should stop applying arms to Israel and Hamas. Well, we don't supply arms to Hamas, but if we were doing it, we should stop. Okay. So sure, same standards should apply, but it's just, you know, it's so fantastically disproportionate that it's almost meaningless to raise the question. I mean, if Hamas, for example, says we'll never recognize Israel, okay, there's a political party has a right to say that. I mean, if a political party in Mexico says I'm never going to recognize the United States, which sits on half of Mexico, obtained by conquest, that's a legitimate position. The ruling party in Israel, Likud, happens to have as its platform, you can pick it up on the internet, its official platform is there cannot be a Palestinian state anywhere in what they call the land of Israel, you know, Jordan to the sea. Okay, it's kind of like Hamas's plan. Nobody talks about it because they're our ally and client, so they can say whatever they want. You know? And they're not only talking about it, they're doing it. But sure, if Hamas fires rockets at Sderot, we should stop helping them do that. And in fact, we should take actions to prevent them from doing it. And we know what the actions are, accept the ceasefire. When the U.S. and Israel did accept the ceasefire, the rockets stopped. And that's officially conceded. You can read it on the Israeli government website, official website. So sure, we should take actions to prevent criminal acts by sub-state actors.
All right, thank you very much.
Sorry?
I know. My name is David Targan. I'm one of the deans here. And I wanted to answer the question that some students had about what we can do about the various political situations that we're hearing about. And actually, the answer to that question lies right here in this room. 18 years ago, the East Timor Action Network established its kind of core here at an event that took place in Solomon 101 when Alan Nairn, a journalist, and Amy Goodman, another journalist, had come here to talk about a recent massacre in East Timor. One of the last massacres, one of the most recent massacres that was part of an ongoing series of massacres that had killed roughly 1/3 of the population of East Timor, and Noam, you've written about that quite a bit. People here actually, it only took a few hundred people. There's only 400 or 500 people in this room. Got together and figured out strategically who to talk to, who to write to within Congress to end military aid to Indonesia. And that was actually the very first step, the very first action by the United States to its ally, Indonesia, to say that we really disapprove of what you're doing in killing innocent Timorese people. And it was the beginning of the end of the occupation and killing in East Timor. Right now, unfortunately, we're back. Yeah, I will. Right now, we're back in a similar situation, and that is that we're about to about to resume military aid to Indonesia. And I was wondering what your thoughts about that were and what we could do about that at this point in history.
Yeah, actually, the forming ETAN, the East Timor Action Network, was quite an important action. The Indonesian invasion of East Timor began in 1975 with strong U.S. support all the way through. Also support of Britain, France, and others. Indonesia's a rich country, it's advantageous to be friendly to them. And as you said, it killed, maybe the worst act of genocide in the late 20th century, or one of the worst. All completely with U.S. support. Opposition actually began in 75, but it was minuscule. Talked to two people about it. It did build up, and after the Dili massacre, the one you're talking about, when Alan Nairn and Amy Goodman were attacked by Indonesian forces, it did get some publicity, and groups, and ETAN was formed, and that was extremely important. And remember, that was 1991, and the killing went on for another 8 years. The Clinton administration strongly supported Suharto. He was our kind of guy. The Clinton administration said right through 1999, atrocities and massacres continued. It's particularly striking because this was the same year that there was a lot of agonizing about the Serbian atrocities in Kosovo, which were nowhere near as severe as what was going on in East Timor. And of course, the background didn't even come close. Finally, there was a major massacre in August 1999, and at that point, international protest and domestic protest, which by then had built up, and ETAN had a lot to do with this, international protest against Clinton was so strong that he took a very simple step. He told the Indonesian army, it's over. Literally. They had sworn they're never going to depart. This is our province, we're never going to leave. As soon as they got, a word from the master saying, game's over, they immediately withdrew. Okay, that tells you something. That tells you for the preceding 25 years, the United States could have stopped it, with a flick of a wrist. You didn't have to bomb Jakarta, you didn't need sanctions, you didn't need anything. Just stop supporting it, and it's over. It's kind of a little like what happened with South Africa, and it could happen in this case too.
Just to follow up, what could students do?
What can we do now? Well, we've got to protest about it. Actually, Alan Nairn, who's pretty much living in Indonesia now and taking very dangerous steps. Alan is a fantastic person, is now challenging the Indonesian army to arrest him in Indonesia. He's publicly charging them with atrocities that he's exposed. And it's not a trivial thing to do in Indonesia. Not a nice place. So he's protesting it quite openly. He's insisting on being allowed to appear on television to denounce them, do something about it. And he's calling, of course, for an end to military aid to them. And ETAN is too. So sure, we can join those efforts and support him. He's still facing serious danger.
Thank you so much once again for coming today, Professor Chomsky. And as a member of Brown Students for Justice in Palestine, we would really like to thank you for your message of support. But my question relates towards the nuclear weapons, particularly the American facilitation of both the expansion of weapons programs in Israel, Pakistan, and India, which all seem to be rather schizophrenic given their complicated histories, not only among India and Pakistan, but particularly among Pakistan and Israel, and India's vacillating relationship with Israel. So I was hoping you could comment on that.
On the Israel-India relationship?
On just all three and the ways
all
in which
three.
it seems, and the second, I guess, equally schizophrenic policy of the U.S. supporting really just brutal regimes, particularly the Saudi and Arab monarchs and the Egyptian government who in no way respect human rights, and how that facilitates American policy within the Middle East and how that relates to Israel.
It's pretty straight. Let's take Egypt, one of the worst dictatorships in the region, very harsh, brutal dictatorship. You all read about Obama's trip to Cairo and how he was praised, for opening his heart to the a Muslim world, everything's going to be different, you know, we love you, and so on. What didn't get much play, maybe almost nothing, is a press conference where he was asked on his way to Egypt, what are you going to say about Egypt's, as they put it, authoritarian regime? I mean, authoritarian is quite an understatement. But what are you going to say about Egypt's authoritarian regime? Well, take a look at Obama's answer. He said, I don't like to use labels for folks. When a politician pronounces the word folks, you just get ready for the next series of lies that's coming out. Otherwise, you talk about people. But if you refer to folks, you know. So the next thing that came out is he's a good man, Mubarak. He's running a stable society, and he's our friend. So I'm not going to criticize anything. Okay. What do you think Egyptians or anybody in the Middle East how seriously can they take his comments about human rights violations in Iran? How seriously should we take them? And Saudi Arabia is even worse. You know? So what does this do for us? I mean, these are loyal clients. The Middle East energy reserves are one of the most important issues in the world. You go back to the 1940s, high-level U.S. planners were talking about how this is what they called a stupendous source of strategic power. I mean, one of the greatest material prizes in world history. If we can control that region, we can control the world, and so on. And that hasn't changed. That's why the U.S. has a massive intervention in the Middle East all the way through, replacing Britain, which used to be in the forefront. Yes, they support dictatorial regimes. I mean, it's very well understood. You recall George Bush's plaintive question, why do they hate us? And the answer, they hate our freedom and so on. I mean, the press was kind enough not to report, or commentators, that the same question had been asked by Eisenhower in 1958. He raised the question, why is there a campaign of hatred against us among the people of the Middle East? Not the governments, but among the people. And it was a little surprising in 1958 because that was right after the U.S. had intervened to kick Israel, England, and France out of Egypt, which they invaded. But still there was a campaign of hatred. Well, the National Security Council released, highest planning body, released a study of it and said it's true that they said there's a perception in the Middle East that the United States supports harsh and dictatorial regimes and blocks democracy and development, and we do it because we want to gain control over their resources. And it went on to say, well, the perception is more or less accurate, and that's what we should do. Okay, so they don't hate us because they hate our freedoms. They hate us because they want their freedoms. And they understand that the U.S. supports dictatorial, oppressive regimes, blocks democracy and development, and we do it because that's the way we control things. And it's the same today. Actually, after Bush's rather ignorant question, the Defense Science Board, one of the main advisory panels of the Pentagon, it came out with a study, why do they hate us study, and they said, it's not our freedoms, it's our policies. They hate our policies for good reasons, as long as so why do we continue the policies when we know it's going to lead to hatred? It's because we're trusting the dictatorships to hold down their populations. Just as we're trusting Keith Dayton's army to keep control of the Palestinians so they'll be a legitimate partner for Israel. I mean, that's our policy, not only there, but all over the world. And we didn't invent it. The British did the same, the French did the same, and so on. Those are imperial policies. If we're in favor of them, okay, let's be honest about it at least, and not pretend we're some kind of a messianic Wilsonian state. We're not.
The three countries with nuclear weapons.
Oh, the three countries
with
nuclear
NPT,
weapons. Well,
even
Pakistan developed nuclear weapons during the Reagan years, and the Reagan administration pretended it didn't know. Of course, they knew. The reason is they were supporting Zia-ul-Haq, who's absolutely the worst and most atrocious of the many military dictators that Pakistan had. Zia-ul-Haq was also carrying out radical Islamization of Palestine, of Pakistan, with Saudi support. Most of this, the kind of intellectual roots of terror go right back to Saudi Arabia. And they were giving plenty of money. So they were providing lots of funding for developing, madrasas, actually means schools, but special religious schools where the children are trained just in extremist, all they do is read the Quran and, learn about extremist versions of Islam, the Saudi versions. And Reagan was supporting that. So we supported part of his legacy is, Al-Qaeda style terrorism. Another part is Pakistani nuclear weapons. And the reason for it was, the Reagan administration was, and also the Democrats were very excited about Afghanistan. They were gathering up the most extreme radical Islamist fanatics they could find anywhere in the world and sending them to Afghanistan and arming them with advanced weapons and so on. The goal was not to liberate Afghanistan. In fact, the head of the CIA station in Islamabad, Pakistan, who was running the operation, was very straight about it. He said, we don't care one way or another about Afghanistan. The point is to kill Russians. And he said, that's a noble goal, and that's what we want to do. When they got that goal, they left Pakistan in the hands of the U.S.-backed warlords who were so vicious that when the Taliban came, they were welcomed. So that's Pakistan. India, actually the U.S., as long as India was either neutralist or had pretty good relations with the Russians, the U.S. was opposed to their developing nuclear weapons and imposed sanctions. But by the last 10 years or so, India has been drifting towards a closer alliance with Israel and the United States. So, and part of that context is, well, they can have nuclear weapons if they like, and we'll support it. The treaty that granted India the right to develop nuclear weapons with our support has a somewhat broader context. For one thing, it was sold here straight out as for commercial advantage. That opens up India to arms sales from the United States, sales of nuclear technology and so on, like a big market and growing country. But also it has to do with Iran. I mean, a centerpiece of U.S. policy is to isolate Iran. Now, India is energy short, and the obvious way for them to get energy is with a pipeline from Iran, an Iran-Pakistan, India pipeline, because Iran is rich in energy. But the U.S. doesn't want that. It wants them not to get Iranian energy. Part of the way to talk them out of it was to give them support with developing nuclear energy, which meant freeing up nuclear weapons development. And actually the invasion of Afghanistan has to do with that too. I mean, in the background of the invasion of Afghanistan, this goes back 20 years, is the idea of setting up a pipeline from Turkmenistan, Central Asia, which is very rich in natural gas, one of the biggest in the world, a pipeline from there to India, which would run through Afghanistan. In fact, it would run through Kandahar, the place that they're now planning to attack. And that pipeline, if it could be established, would have two functions. For one thing, it would undermine efforts to establish Iran-India relations, and it would also undermine Russia's efforts to maintain control of its former, parts of what used to be the Soviet Union. That's a kind of a background consideration for the invasion of Afghanistan. Nobody knows just how significant it is. But in that context, it's understandable, can't approve of it, but it's understandable why the U.S. government, both Republicans and Democrats, would agree to support India's violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and develop nuclear weapons. As far as Israel's concerned, that goes back to the Nixon administration. The Nixon administration made a deal with Israel that, if you're interested in the details, the main book about it is by an Israeli analyst, Avner Cohen. It's in English. But what he reports is that, it's not on paper, but it's assumed that Nixon and Prime Minister Golda Meir just made a deal that the U.S. would permit Israel to maintain its policy of silence, not admitting that it has nuclear weapons and not denying it, and that the U.S. would not interfere with that. And Obama reiterated that after the International Atomic Energy Agency called on Israel to open up its facilities. So yeah, it's a client state. It's a valued U.S. ally. So if they want to have nuclear weapons, okay.
You started addressing the question, but you've been talking extensively about what international laws we've violated and how we violated them. But maybe what I would like you to elaborate a little bit on is why we've violated them. And as a follow-up to that is, what concern to local populations / international law we should give in our quest to global domination and our accessing local natural resources?
Well, look, I'm supposed some unbelievably powerful country, from Mars, decided to take over U.S. agricultural and mineral resources because they wanted them. I suppose they were powerful enough to do it. What would we say they should do? Well, we know what we would say they should do. Okay, same when we carry out what's literally called protecting our resources. So you go back to top U.S. planners, George Kennan and the rest. We say we have to use force to protect our resources, which happen to be in other countries, but that's kind of like an accident of history. Clinton, for example, his official doctrine, which was worse than Bush's, but it was quiet, so we made a fuss about it. But the official doctrine was that the U.S. Maintains the right to use force to ensure our control over markets and resources elsewhere. Okay? That's our commitment. Should we do that? Should any other country do that? I mean, did we support Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait? Why not? I mean, he was trying to take control of their resources, which he actually had a claim on. There's a serious Iraqi claim to Kuwait, which was sort of stolen from Iraq by the British to block Iraqi access to the sea when they established. But did we say, okay, that's fine, you can protect you can take your resources by invading Kuwait? I mean, we have a principle about this, and we apply it to everyone except ourselves or our clients. Okay, should we do that? Well, it depends whether you like to live in a criminal state, in a criminal society. As far as why we violate international law, the answer is pretty straightforward, because we can get away with it. There's nobody else in the world who's going to do anything about it, and as long as the American population is passive and obedient, nobody will do anything about it here. I mean, take, say, the World Court case that I mentioned. To repeat, the U.S. is the only country now, having lost the companionship of Albania and Libya, the only country that has violated a World Court decision. Take a careful look at that World Court decision. It's very illuminating. The court, Nicaragua brought a case to the World Court run by a very distinguished international lawyer, Harvard law professor. The World Court threw out most of the case, almost the entire case, and just drew a decision on very narrow grounds, bilateral Nicaraguan-U.S. treaty. Why'd they throw out the case? Because the World Court's rules require that it cannot adjudicate a conflict unless both parties agree to the jurisdiction. Now, when the U.S. accepted World Court jurisdiction in 1946, it added a reservation saying that the U.S. is immune to any case that relies on international law, meaning anything involving the UN Charter or the Charter of the Organization of American States. The U.S. is immune to anything brought up under those conditions, meaning the U.S., this is 1946, when it was pretty much running the world, essentially said, look, we do not accept jurisdiction. We do not accept the application of international law to ourselves. And the World Court accepted that. That's the way its rules work. And it even goes on. I mean, a couple of years ago, I forget, early 2000s, Yugoslavia brought a case to the World Court about the NATO bombing of Serbia. Okay, one of the charges in the indictment, the petition that they brought to the court, was on genocide. Well, the U.S. withdrew from the court proceedings on the valid grounds that when the U.S. signed the Genocide Convention after 40 years, it added a reservation saying it doesn't apply to us. Okay, so we're free to commit genocide. Well, okay, we're free to commit genocide. We're free to violate the UN Charter or any other international treaty because we say so. Okay? And we can say so. First of all, practically nobody knows it. You have to be kind of like a specialist in the topic to know it. I mean, if we cared about our freedom, you'd teach this kind of thing in elementary school. But almost nobody knows it except a few specialists. And if it's brought up, it would be considered perfectly legitimate. I mean, take, say, the International Criminal Court. When the International Criminal Court was established a couple of years ago, it was not permitted to include the crime of aggression, the most serious crime of all, because the U.S. wouldn't tolerate that. We don't want the charges of aggression to be floating around because we do too much of it. So that was knocked off. Then, even after that, the U.S. refused to accept the jurisdiction of the court. Now, the public wants to. I mean, the public is strongly in favor of accepting international jurisdiction, but elites are not. So the U.S. rejected the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And in fact, a couple of years ago, Congress passed a law, which the President signed, which in Europe is sometimes called the Netherlands Invasion Act. The law authorizes the President of the United States to invade Holland if any American is brought to The Hague, to the International Court, to rescue them. I mean, can anybody else even say that? Okay. If you're a big enough bully and you have an obedient population, you can do what you like.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi. I was thinking, you talked earlier on that the USA and Israel work hand in hand together, committing war crimes and breaking international laws. And I know that the USA gives over $1 billion to Israel annually, and we as U.S. citizens, we recently just did our taxes, and I couldn't help but think, wow, some of my tax money is going to go to Israel to help kill my family and friends in Palestine. And then, as Americans, we go and try to enter Palestine/Israel, and we were given denied entry. And our American citizenship are stripped away from us, and they give us no reason why. Like, they give no explanations. Denied entry, and that's about it.
Who are you referring to?
I guess a lot of my friends and families who are not necessarily Palestinian Americans, but also Asian Americans and
are just not allowed entry, you mean?
Yeah, are given denied entry, but are given no explanations.
That's the least of it. Yeah, that's actually there are a few Jews who are not allowed entry, like Richard Falk, the UN rapporteur for Gaza, or Norman Finkelstein, maybe others, Americans, who happen to be Jewish. But sure, that's bad. But that doesn't begin to compare with the crimes that are being committed in the occupied territories. And certainly, when American citizens pay taxes, not only are they helping fund Israel, but though they don't know it, they're funding an organization which is committed by law in Israel to work for only for the benefit of people, I'm quoting, of of Jewish race, religion, and origin. And that organization is not a small one. It happens to control about 90% of the land in Israel. And Americans are contributing to that because that organization has tax-free status. It's called the Jewish National Fund. I mean, would you want to contribute to an organization that is bound by law to, say in the United States, to control 90% of the land for the benefit of people of, white religion, race, and origin or something? I mean, that's kept very quiet because if Americans knew anything about this, they wouldn't like it. So, okay, that's the task of people who care about the world. Let people know.